very excited for this conversation tonight. For everyone who knows us or doesn't, I'm Phillisa Cramer. I'm JTA's editor-in-chief, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by Sasha Vasilyuk, the author of Your Presence is Mandatory, an award-winning work of fiction based based loosely or not so loosely on her family, which uh, you know, which will enable us to talk. The book is about a family. I'm sorry, reset myself. An award-winning book that everyone should read that we're gonna hear about in a moment. Also a journalist who has covered the region for a long time. And we are together on the fourth anniversary of the start of the full-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine. We've been together, I think, for some of you, at the very beginning of this war. Again, maybe on the first anniversary, we've had several events, and it's a great time to tune in on some of the big questions that we've talked about over the past 4 years, both about the politics of the war and the experience of the war and its ramifications for Jewish communities in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. And I'm just very excited for this conversation today. So thank you all for joining. Sasha, I would just love for you to start by telling us, for everyone who hasn't read the book. If you haven't read the book, you should. Not everyone's read every book all the time. It's a challenge. For everyone who hasn't read the book or isn't familiar with your biography, I'd love for you to just kind of situate us. Who are you? What is your experience vis-a-vis both countries that are in this conflict? And tell us just a little bit about the work that you did in the book and the kind of questions or that it or insights that it offers for this moment in history. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Phillisa, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. I think it's really important to keep paying attention to what is happening in Europe today. I want to, before I kind of tell you about myself, I want to say that Putin's reign today is now longer than Hitler's. And I think that framing is sort of helpful because we think of World War II, all of us in this room, as as this kind of pivotal event in history that took a certain amount of time, that was kind of endless and killed so many people. Um, and yet here we are with this new 21st version of killing on the exact same land, except by different people. So I come from all three places involved, which is to say that I was born in Ukraine when it was still part of the Soviet Union. We then moved to Moscow, to Russia, and 6 years later, when I was on the verge of being 13, we moved to San Francisco, which is where I am today. My family, until kind of about a year ago, was split, and I had family both in Ukraine and in Russia. I no longer have any blood relatives left in Russia because they left Putin's Russia. I still have family in Ukraine. Part of the Ukrainian part of the family have become refugees in various European nations, and part has stayed and are now in Kiev. So that's sort of my background, kind of ethnically, or where I come from. Um, my grandfather my paternal grandfather was Jewish. He married a Ukrainian woman, and they are kind of at the core of my debut novel that I wrote, that I'll get to in a second. And then professionally, before this is my first work of fiction until now, I worked as a journalist, kind of on and off, reporting on daily news in the Bay Area, but also just doing kind of fun stories on travel and culture and things like that. Since the invasion, In 2022, I've written opinion pieces that tend to be very personal. I'm not a foreign correspondent based in Ukraine, but I am in touch with people in Ukraine almost on a daily basis. And I think sometimes when you talk about a culture that's very far away, that's not very well known, one of the easiest ways to kind of penetrate through that and help Western readers, American readers, to understand what is going on, but also what it feels like, is to do it kind of in a very personal way. So I've often written about my family and my aunt and how her travails in Ukraine. Now, in terms of the story that I wrote and what it has to do with kind of our topic today, both the war in Ukraine, but also kind of history and memory and World War II. The Jewish Ukrainian grandfather that I mentioned earlier was a vet who, which is somewhat typical, never talked about the war. However, he always kind of proliferated this myth that that he made it to Berlin, that he had all these medals. The medals were stolen on the train, so he can't really show them to us. But he fought the entire length of World War II and survived, which was a pretty rare feat, given that Soviet Union lost 27 million people. Nobody ever questioned the story. We wanted details, but he always refused to say anything more than that and just kind of shied away from the topic in general. When he passed away in 2007, we were going through his things, and my grandmother discovered a confession letter that he'd written back in the 80s, addressed to the KGB, where he revealed that he had kept a secret, at first from the government until we found out, and then from the family, from us as well, about what happened to him during the World War II. So it turned out kind of in a very shocking way that he wasn't like what we assumed. He wasn't a brave soldier that fought the entire length of the war to make it to this final battle in Berlin that defeated fascism. He was, in fact, a young Jewish man who was captured by the Germans very early on in the war, and then had these kind of incredible adventures that he survived while being in Germany as a Jewish man. What it told me, I was in my 20s when this confession letter was discovered, and I found it fascinating. I'd never heard a story like this. And at the same time, I recognized that what I felt about it was sort of shame. POWs was something that was considered a bit of shameful thing in Soviet culture. This is very hard for Western readers and Western people generally to understand. But it had to do with kind of Stalin and how he positioned Soviet Union. It had to do with general distrust of kind of all Western things. It had to do with huge losses that Soviet Union incurred and kind of the positioning that anyone who didn't fight for the motherland essentially sat out the war. And so all these people died while these other people, including POWs, sat out the war, didn't help the effort. And war for decades after the war ended, treated as second-class citizens in sort of in ways such as they wouldn't be admitted into good universities, they wouldn't get great jobs or wouldn't get promoted. So it was this constant kind of stigma that was put on them. Just kind of for statistics, there are about almost 6 million Soviet POWs. In terms of kind of Jewish Soviet POWs, that was also a pretty big number. There were 500,000 Jewish soldiers in Stalin's Red Army during World War II. A lot of them have risen pretty high up, but a lot of them, just statistically possible, were captured. and did not fare very well at all. Only less than 5,000 of them, of the ones who were captured, came back alive. My grandfather was one of them. I'm here because he survived in these incredible ways. So I discovered all this. I found it interesting. I found the fact that he survived and kind of the adventures themselves interesting, but I also found the secrecy around it, the fact that he kept this like super traumatic events for decades from everyone he loved. I found that kind of psychologically very interesting, and I immediately thought somebody should write a novel about it. But it's not going to be me because really who needed another World War II novel was kind of my feeling about it. I felt like there was a lot already there. There's a lot of literature on the Holocaust, and then on World War II in general. There were movies, etc. And I just like didn't find it particularly relevant to today. That was my mistake because in 2014 I war that I didn't think would ever come to Europe, really, in the 21st century, came to Ukraine, and not only to Ukraine, but it came directly to the city where my grandparents lived, a city that I visited every summer all my entire life, and started actually quite directly in front of my grandparents' apartment. By then, my grandfather was dead, but had he seen what was happening, I think he would have had a lot to say on the subject. Um, and part of what I wasn't realizing was happening until I went there to see the war, to visit my family, to see my grandmother for what turned out to be the last time, was that Russia was using World War II and its memory as a very important, like key piece of propaganda to kind of excuse its actions and to explain why it was causing all this trouble in Ukraine. And so these are sort of the two subjects that I wanted to talk about today. Kind of what the links are between the two events, why it's important to know that there is this link, and kind of what it tells us 4 years on about the current news situation in Ukraine.
Thank you. And I forgot to invite everyone. If you have a question, we will have time for that. Please use the Q&A option on your menu rather than the chat, and we will sort through those questions. I think one has already been asked and answered. So please ask questions. We will surface them. Um, so I'd love to get right into that connection. I think one of the things that jumped out, I mean, it was very prominent, but also really jumped out to Jewish news consumers early in the war was Putin's citation of need to denazify Ukraine as a justification for the invasion. And
Yep.
like that was really hard to compute and maybe never computed. And but like even what are the reference points for that were hard to come up with. And I think, for people who don't have the more recent connection to Ukraine, maybe the last memory was running away when there were Nazi collaborators. Um, I think your grandfather's sister from at least the character of your grandfather's sister was killed by a Ukrainian collaborator. Um, and so, those associations are very present for, Jewish observers of the war. I would love for you to tell us, like, what was Putin talking about? To what extent is that still present in the conversation? Um, and I guess how is that idea landing on, for audiences on both sides of this fight?
Yeah. So Putin was a person who was kind of responsible. I mean, he's been a ruler for a long time now, 26 years. And in one of the things he did culturally that was huge and is often overlooked in the West is that he, kind of long before trouble in Ukraine, he re-centralized World War II memory as this like moral foundation of modern Russia and proof of its greatness, right? Like Soviet Union, but whatever. In his mind, Russia equals Soviet Union. They're kind of one and the same. Was a place that was A, attacked, B, incurred like tremendous trauma, and Putin takes World War II very personally. His father, he's a child of post-World War era, and it was a big part of his life. So it's proof of Russia's greatness, uh, and also kind of this huge source of trauma that affected every family. World War II it's a very different experience than it was for Americans. It killed like 25% of people who lived in Belarusia, 15% of people who lived in Ukraine. I mean, the numbers are staggering. Like everybody knew, lots of people who were dead. And so he he kind of took this. He needed a national idea. He really didn't have one, and he knew that he needed something that would kind of unite people after the turbulent 90s. It couldn't be communism anymore, right? But communism as an idea sort of like worked for a decent amount of time. So he needed something new. World War II had the psychological weight of both being like personally, kind of emotionally relevant for everyone, and a source of pride, right? So one of the things he did is kind of the Russian state criminalized falsifying history. That was one of the first steps. So like when you talked about things like World War II, you couldn't, for example, there's a law like you cannot compare Soviet Union to Nazi Germany. That's like a law for which I could probably go to jail because I somewhat do that in the book. And that was kind of the first step toward turning memory, which World War II should have been, kind of from remembrance into this political, I don't know, infrastructure. Then, as the years went on and Kremlin's relationship with the West, with Europe and with America, began to shift, the Kremlin kind of increasingly labeled its opponents as fascists. NATO expansion, which is a topic that people in the Kremlin obsess about, was like rhetorically linked to historical invasion and the trauma that it caused. So in those ways, World War II and its memory was becoming kind of a tool to portray Russia as this perpetually defensive state. The 2014 coup, which is kind of the beginning of how the war in Ukraine started, not coup, sorry, it was not a coup, but it was positioned by Putin's regime as like a fascist coup. So this language, because it was already like World War II memory, it was already built into the cultural conversation. Victory Day parades became this really big national thing that both reflected, I mean, increasingly they reflected the militarism. If you ever pay attention to those, you see parade of giant tanks and whatever that Russia shows off. But even before, kind of a few years ago, it was this major national event. And so, given all that, it became a natural extension of its messaging when Ukraine was being invaded by Russia, kind of first regionally and now fully, to use the same type of lingo to refer then to World War II. And denazification became this part concept. It is, I think, mostly in its intention, speaking to the Russian audience because it does not really make any sense to anyone in the West. And no one in the West is as obsessed with World War II. But to the Russian audience, it is kind of part of the lingo that has been spoken for years until then. And given that there's this fear of, the West, they try to take us over, and now that seems to be what they're doing. They're trying to steal Ukraine, which is our kind of birthplace of our great Russian state. It then is an easy step and kind of a convincing step for Putin when he talks to his domestic audience to then portray it as this place that needs to be cleansed of really bad Western slash nationalistic slash Nazi slash whatever influence. To Ukrainian audience, none of this makes any sense either. It is a rhetorical device, and they understand it as such. They make fun of it. However, it remains, I believe, till today, one of the things in the peace deal. So currently, Ukraine and Russia and the U.S. with Steve Witkoff, they're talking, they're trying to make something happen. To me, it is, and not only to me, it is very unclear that Russia wants anything to happen. I think they're just kind of talking without actually, wanting the end result, which is a typical Putin strategy. But denazification remains like as one of the things that they're asking for. Ukrainians are always kind of raise their hands and like, what is that? We're not, that means nothing. We have a Jewish president, like leave us alone. But it's just part of kind of the rhetoric that Russia stubbornly continues to use.
Do you like my head is hurting trying to adopt the Russian mindset that you just explained to try to like make it make a little bit of sense? Do you have a sense of like does Putin have metrics for what that would be, or does he know that he's like does he believe in it himself?
Oh, I mean, Jesus,
You asked me to get into the Russian mind, so please, you get into Putin's.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess I talked about two things that are so hard to translate to Western audience, which is, decades of shame being used as a way to control its population for people who are survivors and shouldn't be ashamed of surviving, and yet have been made ashamed to survive, which is just like is crazy to American audiences. And this obsession with history, with the way it's told, with kind of Russia's like idea of itself. I think like when if we just get back to kind of the basics, like why did Putin invade Ukraine? Like it's sort of a question that I think people forget to ask at this point because we've been looking at this war for so long and we're all sick of it. Everyone's sick of it on all sides involved. Um, and it's in my mind, it's two reasons. Putin wants to take Ukraine over. Like he thinks it's part of this land. He is a very Soviet man in his mind. He's 70 years old. Most of his life, a lot of his career was spent in Soviet Union, and you cannot kind of change or upgrade his thinking to more modern ways. Um, but I think he also, the other thing he wants is a new world order, like a change, like an upgraded status of Russia. He does feel, I think, that Russia didn't get its dues. It struggled in the 90s. He thinks people took advantage of it. He also, I think, world like Russia or Soviet Union, and as part of it, Russia was never, because of the Cold War, it was not recognized as for its major contribution to winning the World War II. Even today, if you go to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, it mentions Soviet Union, I think, twice in the entire museum. Once in reference to Stalin and once in reference to the 27 million people that it lost. And this is a result of like the Cold War policies that for decades kind of divided the American version of events and the Soviet version of events. And given the losses that Soviet Union incurred, it can partly make sense why they feel like we did this huge thing. We saved the world from fascism, and this is how like it's positioned in Russia. And what did we get in return? Like, no one even thanks us. No one even kind of recognizes our ability um, to have saved the world from the Nazis. So there's this like bitterness, I think, at the heart of the whole thing. Um, and Ukraine is kind of caught in the middle of it. If we want to get back to your kind of question about collaborationists, and obviously this is a very like historically complicated topic, but I know it's very relevant to the audience listening here today. One thing that I learned in my research that really shocked me as somebody who grew up on like certain World War II myths that are taught in Russia and maybe used to be in Ukraine, I don't know, was that a lot of people in all of Soviet Union were looking forward to the Germans arriving. This completely shocked me because, right, like now we know what happened. We know they were bad. They did a lot of awful things. But back then, it was not known. And here, just imagine like, millions of Soviet people who live under a man named Stalin. Their life is not great. They've struggled a ton. And here are kind of the Europeans with their poets and philosophers and centuries of great culture. They're going to come to our backwater Russia or Belarus, Ukraine. They're going to get rid of Stalin, and we will be living like an amazing new European life. Um, this was not thinking that was just kind of like in Ukraine, people who really wanted to separate from Stalin, who were nationalists, who wanted Ukraine to be sovereign and aligned with Nazis. It was not just exclusively that group. It was extremely common thinking. And you can kind of, when you research that period, you discover that how common it really was. And it took the Germans arriving and for the locals to see how they're behaving, how terrible they were, to realize that this is not a nation of poets and philosophers who's coming to make their life better. That is not at all the project, right? And this is long before the internet and before information could be disseminated as easily. But yeah, kind of this question, I think this is a helpful broader context to understand that people in Soviet Union had different agendas. And they started defending their country only after they realized how badly the enemy was behaving, but not before that.
And I was struck by that in your fictionalization of your grandfather's experience because even at the end of I mean, he spent the war in Germany, and even as he's leaving, he's thinking like, this is really nice. Like, why did they try and come take over my, you know, crappy town and I hadn't ever thought about that. So I appreciate the story um for bringing that to me. We had a question about the death of 3 million Ukrainians during collectivization. Did that weigh at all in the Ukrainian consciousness? I don't think we need your expertise to say yes. That's part of the story that you tell as well. Just can you kind of summarize what that was about and how recent of an experience was that once World War II began?
Yeah, so both my grandparents survived the famine. It's called Holodomor. It's it. What's interesting about it, they were both children, and my grandmother, who wrote a memoir, has very descriptive, very hard to read paragraphs about what it was like. Um, and yeah, it happened in 1932, 1933, and World War II, or the invasion, Hitler's invasion of USSR was only 8 years later, in 41. So it affected, the same exact generation of people. So almost essentially like every soldier, if they were from Ukraine, every soldier fighting in the Red Army in World War II was a child who survived the famine. So, of course, for something like that, an experience like that, I think it changed you mentally, it changed you probably physically as well, having survived something like that. I found it particularly relevant when I was working on my book, not only because, like, here I wrote about two people who actually survived a major famine of the 20th century, but more because it was something that was hidden by the USSR from the West, right? They were trying to, I mean, I guess maybe all countries do it. All countries, America is one of them for sure, loves to portray itself as a great place. Soviet Union was um, majorly into giving itself, patting itself on the back, and both internally and externally. And so a famine doesn't look so great for a country that is quite new at that time and is trying to build itself up and industrialize. So they hid it from the West, but they also, like, strangely were able to kind of hide it internally, domestically. So, for example, for decades, the word that is now used to describe the famine was not used. The word implies that this was a famine done by the government on purpose. And for decades, the famine was positioned, like, people knew it happened, right? Because lots of people died, but it was positioned as like a natural disaster, really bad winter with really bad crops, and oops, lots of people died. That was not what happened, but it was a very, and remains, and for Ukrainians, remains like a very important part of their history and something that is constantly contested by Russia. Because essentially the famine by Ukrainians is positioned as the Russians tried to kill Ukrainians, to summarize, or Stalin's, Russians were trying to kill Ukrainians off, like, as a nation in a way. And Russia doesn't like that positioning for obvious reasons, and kind of continues to contest the story. And so something that happened in the 30s is still, it's 90 years later, um, is still part of the conversation because Russia continues to change history, to weaponize it, to use it as a tool to kind of to change its messaging for domestic and foreign audience.
I'm curious, one thing that struck me, you've talked about the shame um, that prisoners of war felt. One thing that struck me reading the novel was how aware the characters were at the time that that was going to be a problem in the future. So it didn't take time for that narrative to be established. It sounds like it existed already as it was happening. And I'm curious if you see, um, if you could you prognosticate about, are there any narratives emerging now about this war that in 80 years some of us, some other people might be unpacking about the strange narratives that set in um, around this current war?
That's a great question. I think there is a huge, besides the actual things on the battlefield where lots of people are dying on both sides, there is and has been from day zero a huge information war. Both countries spent enormous resources on that. I think part of kind of Zelensky's biggest contribution to the fact that Ukraine, like, still exists today was that he understood that. He comes from the entertainment industry. He understood from TV. He understands how important messaging is. And his kind of early on in those first really crucial months or weeks and months, spent a lot of time and energy to making the world care about a place that most people in the world did not know or could not point on the map, right? Until 2022. And so I think there's Putin also is a huge believer in the information war. Russia has, pretty endless resources, and it spends a lot of them on meddling in our elections, like doing all these things that have to do with changing people's minds, and kind of turning them toward Russia and its thinking and its goals. Um, so, I don't know how this war is going to end. I certainly hope, however, that it ends quickly, um, and that Ukraine is a place that still exists because it should, as a sovereign nation. But depending on how it ends, I think that messaging and the conflict of messaging will continue will continue being discussed. Like from day one, Russia was saying, kind of was pointing the finger at the West, and there was I often heard, even here in the U.S. that it's like, oh, the U.S. caused this war. Ukraine is just like no one really cares about Ukraine. This is a conflict. This is a Cold War kind of conflict between Russia and America, and Ukraine is just caught in the middle. Um, and that I think, like I find that that's a dangerous narrative because it then takes blame kind of off of Russia of like attacking another nation. The blame should just directly lie with the person who attacks another person, right, or another nation. Um, and then one thing, sorry, somewhat unrelated, but I just forgot to mention it earlier, and I think it's important, um, that the treatment of POWs, for instance, right, for me, was important because I'm here because my grandfather survived and it became kind of the heart of the book. But even today, POWs are a huge part of this war. The only kind of the main and only really collaborative effort between the two countries is the exchange of prisoners. So even when they weren't talking at all, like no peace deal, which was a long period of a couple of years, they were still exchanging prisoners. In case people don't know that, so I think that's like important to know. But also there are stories emerging of the awful treatment and the kind of the disappearance often of Ukrainian POWs inside Russia, which to me tells me that their attitude remains very Soviet. Soviet Union did not do anything really to help to help the POWs. All they did is blame them for being captured and for not dying on the battlefield instead. It Lots of them died. 3.2 million of them died, not only because the Germans were intent on murdering as many as they can, which is a story that is very much almost unknown, as opposed to, compared to like the Holocaust and the attention that has received. Soviet POWs is like nobody knows about them, nobody remembers about them, but the numbers are staggering. Um, but part of the reason that so many of them died was not only because Germans wanted them to, but also because Soviet Union did nothing to stop it and to help. And then also continue to not wanting that story to be known. Um, and so the reason nobody knows about it, and the reason I didn't really know much about it until I came across my grandfather's letter, was because I wasn't supposed to know. This was supposed to be an episode of history that was just, inconvenient for Germany and for Soviet Union, and so just was kind of deleted often. But yeah, POWs is something that I think will emerge more in the news as it becomes known as the war ends, of kind of how terrible the treatment in Russia was and how their attitudes are still super backward.
I want to switch gears a little and talk
Yeah,
about talk about Jewish identity and experience in this
sure.
war. We have a question that well, two things reminded me of a story that we did like week one of this war about So we had a question saying, is Zelensky like a hero for the Jewish people, like in as demonstrated in the Purim story? Purim is on our minds calendrically. We had done a story at the beginning, and you also said, he was striving to create he's an entertainer, and he knew he needed to present an image that would galvanize the world around him. We did a story about, there was a fight, like among Jewish pundits, or is he more like a Maccabee, or is he Moses, or is he Mordecai? And it's like 4 years later, I don't know that anybody's arguing any of that. We talked about, 4 years is a long time um, to sustain any narrative, to sustain attention that hadn't been there
Oh,
before.
Phillisa, we can't hear you anymore for some reason.
Are
Can
you
you
sure?
hit mute maybe?
We can hear Phillisa. Sasha, is it something with your connection?
Oh,
Can you hear me?
yeah.
Am I back? Okay, great.
Maybe that was
Um,
me. So apologies.
and we have, thank you to Becky, the uh, spectral assistant here. So it's a long time to sustain any narrative, to sustain, fresh attention. Ukraine has grown, in addition to the time, right, the duration of the war had grown complicated with an internal corruption scandal that kind of takes the shine off a little bit. And I guess I'm curious, uh, we've had several questions, like how can Jews help? Why should Jews particularly care? And I'm curious what your answers to that would be. I think there was a real thirst to find a Jewish story in this war. And 4 years in, it's hard to sustain a story, and there's lots of other stories competing for attention. I'm curious kind of how you would respond to that.
Um, well, one thing I would say is that, as far as I know, America has never had a Jewish president, and most countries have not. Ukraine has a Jewish president. That alone, in and of itself, is worth remembering. I think that given its history, given how American Jews often think of Ukraine historically, I think that's super telling. Um, there are still a lot of Jews who continued, who chose to remain in Ukraine, who chose not to immigrate to the lovely America or, the complicated Israel or whatever. Um, a lot of them are, like my aunt is not a practicing Jewish person at all, which is a Soviet legacy. I also did not grow up, I didn't know I was Jewish until sometime late in elementary school. Um, Actually, when my mom, the first kind of thing she did to tell me that I am this thing called Jewish was to take me to a porn party, which was strategically pretty smart on her part because obviously it's fun. And I was maybe 9 or 10, I don't know. And then sent me to super fun Jewish camps, which contrasted immensely with pioneer camps, which is something that I experienced prior to that. But often for Soviet Jews, like the Jewish part of their experience, the positive part of their experience, the holidays, the food, the language, all of that was really taken away in the grand kind of Soviet Russification project, where the identity was supposed to be primarily as a Soviet citizen, as a productive member of Soviet society, and not as a, minority X or minority Y. And, they largely succeeded, unfortunately, maybe. But I think it is important for American Jews who didn't grow up in that way to still remember that there are lots of Jews who live in Ukraine today, and one of them is the president. Um, so, in terms of this war, right, given that Russia positions its central messaging and its like reason for being there at all as this mythical denazification, I think it is a story that's very important to keep paying attention to. Because if Russia can make stuff up and change history and through that invade a sovereign nation in today's Europe. Um, that's something we all need to care about. That is something that can be borrowed by other politicians and used. Um, to me, I think one thing that I kind of learned in the process of coming across this letter and then seeing my the two countries I grew up in start killing each other, and kind of watching my family torn apart by war that I didn't expect, um, is that one of the things that we in 21st century often maybe dismiss a little bit is, given the internet and the news cycle and the constant changing, attention, um, is that history isn't this thing that's in the past. It tends to, if it's left kind of to rot, if an entire generation, which is what happened to my grandparents, is silenced through fear and shame and whatever tools, and is too afraid and too ashamed and too whatever to pass on their witness accounts of what they saw. It leaves space for governments with their various agendas to take historical narrative, to falsify it, and to then claim there's a neighbor nation full of Nazis and we must save the world from them. So for me, I think that was kind of the primary lesson that I learned, that every narrative matters, that narratives should be passed on privately, that nobody should be afraid of their trauma because future generations need to be learning from that trauma so that they're not repeating the same mistakes, so that they're not believing in falsified historical narratives. And so that history cannot be used as like a weapon to actually kill lots of people, which is what's happening today. So I think all of that is very relevant to Jews because you know, everything we lived in. And yes, I know it's hard to pay attention. I know there's things in Israel and things in Iran and Gaza and, the world. And like just Trump is this constant machine of attention. But this is Europe we're talking about. Europe that I think is it's a nice place, I'm sure lots of us like to visit. It would be sad if it partly fell under Putin because it's not fun to visit Putin's Russia lately, especially.
Not fun and for many people not possible. We have a few minutes left in this program. We've talked a lot about history and its long tail. I want to spend a couple minutes on now and looking ahead. One thing that we've kind of seen throughout the last 4 years in our coverage is, connects, I think, to the experiences and themes in your family's story about the the complexity of identity among Ukrainians, and that people have Jews and Christians and Muslims and atheists all in the same family, and sometimes the people who are promoting the Jewish history or identity aren't the Jews in the family, and it's all mixed up. I think we've seen over the last 4 years identity awakened in many Ukrainians in new ways, sometimes because there's a way out. If you're Jewish, that's one thing that might make you reconnect with your Jewish past or your family's Jewish past. There's also a strong Jewish infrastructure delivering support, which is only growing more and more needed as conditions get more difficult for Ukrainians. I'm curious kind of if you could share anything that you've seen or heard about shifting Jewish identity in Ukraine during the war, and if you want to expand that to kind of your take on the current experience of the war for Ukrainians, that would be fine too.
Yeah, I probably know a little bit more about the second than the first. I have a friend, an author friend, Paul Goldberg, who follows kind of the Jewish and specifically follows like any kind of incidents of anti-Semitism in Ukraine over the last years. I think he works with some organization that's on top of that. I think it's interesting. Bobby Yar, which is I'm sure most of us here know, but just in case, is where I think 70,000 Jews were murdered in Kiev in this ravine, in September 29th, 1941. That the memorial to that, the Soviet Union had a whole thing about not making a memorial out of it, and then when a plaque finally appeared, it said, Soviet citizens died here, kind of thing. It was very much specifically not wanting to call out Jews as the primary target. But that has changed, and you can see it because the memorial, which is this whole big, lots of project with billionaires and oligarchs involved, opened in 2021, right before the invasion of Ukraine. So that's interesting. I think what you point out that sometimes Jewish identity is awakened when there's direct help from Jewish organizations. I've definitely seen that happen in the 90s as well, which I think I don't judge anybody for doing that. My grandma, the non-Jewish one, she volunteered. This is something I described in the book a little bit because I thought it was interesting. She volunteered for a Jewish organization in the 90s because she was bored and needed a job, or she was retired and just wanted something to do. And then she built a library because so many Jewish immigrants or Jews were immigrating out of Ukraine in the 90s and would leave books. And so she built this entire Jewish library. But Germany in the 90s started giving reparation money, and to receive reparation money, you had to kind of prove that bad things happened to you when you were a Jew in Ukraine in World War II. And she was this people would talk to her and get her help on filling out these applications for reparation, which is, I think, similar to kind of what you're describing today, right? Once help was offered and your identity is involved to prove it, you're going to use it if you need help. And now I forgot the second part of your question. Oh, just generally today. So I have a friend who's very high up in the government in Ukraine. And I told him that I'm going to speak to a bunch of people today and what message he wanted me to pass on to you guys. And he told me that he wanted Americans to know that the war is still on. Even if it's not on your news feeds, there are people in trenches dying. It's been really, really probably the worst winter of the war because the Russians figured out how to attack infrastructure that was unprotected. So my aunt who has cancer and probably doesn't have that much more to live, has no heat or electricity 18 hours a day, every day for the last 2 months. So one thing he wanted me to pass on is that this war is still on. So we need to be paying attention, but that is very hard for Ukraine without the help from the US. Things are going better, oddly, for Ukrainians on the battlefield. I think Russia's kind of having recruiting issues and they're recruiting just random untrained people. But even with that, it's a numbers game as well. So they really need help from the US, continued support, and with different administrations, there's challenges that come with that as people in the government change dramatically. And ultimately, he told me that they need to join the EU, which has been an issue at the heart of this war, really, from the beginning.
I would encourage everyone to read our latest story about Jews in Ukraine. Gets at some of, the experiences that everyone's having with power and heat and electricity cuts. I was kind of surprised and amazed to see the landscape of resilience hubs that have gone up now
Oh,
in the
yeah.
heart of
Those
Kyiv.
are,
Um, with, you can charge and you can get a hot meal and charge your phone before you go back to your cold, dark apartment that you have to walk up 12 flights to get to. It seems like a level of privation that is new in the cities this winter and hard to imagine. Um, I'm really
And yet I
sorry
think
yeah.
historically they often think of their grandparents and they think like, well, they survived worse. So we can do this too. There's incredible videos of like DJ parties in courtyards where everyone is with mugs of tea. And it's
And
just,
like
I don't know, it's
with
always,
parkas you can't even imagine. Yes.
yeah, and it's always heartwarming to see people like having fun given this just terrible, terrible, horrible conditions. So, sorry, please continue, please.
No, and I'm sorry to those of you who weren't able to get to all the questions. You are in luck because we will keep covering Jewish Ukraine, and you can continue to tune into JTA for stories. Of course, fill out your news diet with diplomacy coverage elsewhere. I guess my last question for you is, I feel like I heard you say, I don't think Putin has any intention to end this war, and I heard you say, I think this war is going to end. It has to, and like. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think we'll be here again in a year, um, talking about the fifth anniversary of this war, or just how would you encourage us to think about what lies ahead?
I remember I was asked a very similar question on the second day of the invasion on live TV because I had an article come out in the New York Times anyway, and it's just like Americans generally are sort of optimists on average, obviously. I can't generalize like that, but I was like more optimistic than people in Eastern Europe, Russia more so than Ukraine. Um, and I wasn't optimistic about the war ending in 2 days when the reporter asked me. I do think the fact that they are talking, because they haven't been at all for a long time, is encouraging. At the same time, I don't, unless something shifts in Putin's mindset or somebody shifts it for him, but he is a pretty isolated dude. Um, I think it's hard. He's not gonna, unless he gives like the go ahead and the green light, all the negotiators are just gonna keep talking. He tends to also he has this kind of tell he sends a certain person when he green lighted a yes and a different person when the answer is really no. And you see that other person a lot. I'm not going to say who it is because it doesn't matter, but that person is the one you often see in international negotiations, and he's like the no guy, who's just going to be there, but the answer is going to be no. So we'll see. I am hopeful. I do think that it's going to take the Americans and the Europeans to force his hand. The question is, do they want to? And I cannot answer that for Mr. Trump. He has to figure that out himself.
I think I'll just close by paraphrasing two of the women that we quoted in our most recent story. Um, it was the story is really great, and it focused on women who are working with children and living on the front lines. And two sentiments that really have stuck with me. One was, you know, the the diplomats are going to do what they're going to do, and I'm going to do what I need to do. And I have children who are traumatized and who need schooling and who need to learn about Judaism, and I'm going to do that. Um, and then another person who said, well, I'm going to do what I need to do, but I'm also a little bit worried that we're going to be like Israel and live in a forever war. Um, and I think that those are two ideas prevailing among Ukrainian Jews right now, complementary, not contradictory, but very challenging, I think, to know that that's the situation 4 years in. I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Absolutely recommend the book. Um,
Thank,
and thank you so much, Sasha. Thank you
thank you,
everyone for
Phillisa,
joining.
and thank you everyone for being here and for caring. Appreciate it.
Good night.